Guy Walters revisits the bloody trail left by Munich terrorists. Frankly, it's hard to think of a more shameful act for a British politician than to attend a commemoration for some of the worst terrorists the world has known. There is no other way to describe the vile terror organization Black September. The murderous actions in the early 70s of this gang of Palestinian nationalists easily rivaled their terrorist brothers in arms from the same period, such as the Baader-Meinhof gang, a hard-left German terrorist organization largely populated with middle-class Marxists, or, indeed, the Provisional IRA. Named after a particularly brutal and devastating military campaign carried out by the Jordanians against the Palestine Liberation Organization in September 1970, the group was formed by the Palestinians to strike back at Jordan. However, its remit soon expanded into global terrorism, to devastating effect. Although the group is, of course, most notorious for its massacre of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich, Black September was also responsible for scores of letter bombs, hostage-takings, assassinations and murders that took place all over the world for 2 dark years from August 1971 to August 1973. If, as Mr. Corbyn claims, he was in Tunisia in 2014 to remember everyone who died in every terrorist incident everywhere, then perhaps instead of mourning the likes of Black September terrorists, he should show more genuine sympathy for the victims of violence by composing letters of condolence to the families of the group's victims. Perhaps the Labour leader would care to write to the families of Cleo Noel, the United States ambassador to Sudan, and his deputy, George Curtis Moore, who were among 10 hostages taken by 8 Black September gunmen when they stormed the Saudi embassy in Khartoum in March 1973. The terrorists insisted the hostages' lives would be spared if members of Baader-Meinhof were released from prison, as well as Sirhan, jailed for assassinating Robert F. Kennedy in June 1968. President Richard Nixon refused to negotiate and, as a result, Black September took Noel and Moore, along with a Belgian, Guy Ide, down to the basement and shot them dead. When the members of Black September surrendered and the siege was lifted, the task of identifying the diplomats' bodies fell to a female consular officer, who had never seen a dead body, and an American sergeant called Timothy Wells. A Vietnam veteran, Wells was still revolted by what he saw. The bodies were riddled with so many bullets that the men were unidentifiable, and only their heights provided any clues of their identities. For such disgusting murders, the terrorists got off remarkably lightly, with only 6 of them being prosecuted and then sentenced to jail terms in Egypt, despite the United States pressing hard for the death penalty. 3 of the terrorists subsequently escaped. Black September was clearly delighted by how well the action had gone. The operation gleaned even bigger headlines than a previous one, which ended in a brokerage release deal after they had taken 6 Israelis hostage at the Israeli embassy in Bangkok. In fact, owing to a mixture of bad luck, poor planning and the effectiveness of intelligence organizations such as Israel's Mossad and the U.S. National Security Agency, many Black September operations were thankfully to end in failure. But it was not for want of trying. One audacious operation was the hijacking of Sabena Flight 571 from Brussels to Lod, Tel Aviv, in Israel in May 1972, which ended when Israeli elite commandos stormed the plane, killing 2 of the 4 hijackers and rescuing all the passengers apart from one, who would later die of her injuries. One of the commandos was also shot in the shoulder, but survived. His name was Benjamin Netanyahu, now, of course, the Prime Minister of Israel. One of the most potentially dangerous plots took place in New York shortly after the killings in Khartoum, in which a series of huge bombs were placed in rented cars in locations around the city associated with Israel, such as a branch of the Israel Discount Bank. The bombs, which would have caused mayhem and, according to the FBI, hundreds of deaths, were timed to go off with the arrival in New York of the Israeli Prime Minister, Golda Meir. Thankfully, there was an error in the bomb's circuitry, and they never exploded. The culprit, Khalid al-Jouri, managed to escape, although he was later captured and sentenced to a U.S. prison for 30 years in 1993. He, in fact, served only 16. Al-Jawi is said to have been a key participant in a Black September campaign carried out in late 1972, during which 100 or more letter bombs were sent to Israeli targets all over the world, including the UK. Many of the bombs were sent from Amsterdam, and some were to have devastating effects. On the morning of September 19, the agricultural attaché at the Israeli embassy in London, Dr. Emi Shakwari, opened a package which he thought contained seeds from Holland that he could plant when he got back home. Instead, it contained a bomb, which blew up his desk and sent a splinter of wood straight through his heart, killing him. That month, at least 16 further bombs were intercepted by Scotland Yard. Any of them could have exploded at any stage on their journeys, potentially killing British post office staff. In Israel, Malaysia and New York, postal workers were injured by Black September's bombs, although mercifully, none died. Despite the risk to those not a target, the group continued with the campaign. In November, more bombs were sent to London. One exploded in the face of Vivian Prince, Jewish managing director of a diamond trading company in the city. When colleagues rushed up to his office after hearing the explosion, they found their 54-year-old boss gasping for help with burns and cuts on his face, head, thigh and stomach. Mr. Prince was lucky, he survived. As the letter bombs came shortly after the Munich Olympics atrocity, the gang succeeded in becoming one of the foremost terrorist organizations in the world. However, after some foiled hijackings, the group badly needed another spectacular like Munich. Their chance came in Athens in the summer of 1973. It was at the city's airport in the mid-afternoon of August 5 that Mohammed Jahud and Hussein Talat carried out a massacre that shocked the world. A TWA ground employee called Demetra Mikapoulou saw the two terrorists start the killings. A man about 30 walked up to a table nearby to have his hand luggage checked, she recalled. He suddenly pulled out a grenade and threw it to the ground. Many Britons were to witness what happened next because they were traveling from Athens to Luton with Thomson holidays. There was blood and screaming all around, said Fred Smith. We crawled under a table and crept on our hands and knees outside. Violet Richardson from Essex was lucky. Shrapnel tore through my sleeve, she said, and blood from injured victims spattered over me. It is a wonder we are alive. One couple, Barry and Susan Newton from Speen in Buckinghamshire, were having a drink when the attack started. Minutes later, two terrorists came through with guns and told us to lay on the floor, Mr. Newton said. They were shouting in Arabic, telling people to speak in Arabic and not English. The Newtons stayed on the floor for hours until the killing ended. After a few hours, the terrorists surrendered. They had killed 2 Americans and an Austrian, and injured nearly 60. Mr. Corbyn may wish to write to the relatives of those murdered, Albert Kersing of New Jersey, Jean Salandry from New York, and Wolfgang Elofen from Vienna, whose wife was able to identify his body only from one shoe. In the aftermath, Black September petered out, partly because of the torturous politics within the Palestinian nationalist community, but also because of the successful Israeli campaign of assassinating terrorists in revenge for Munich. Until Mr. Corbyn commemorates all the victims of Black September, rather than only its members, then it is all too easy to see where his sympathies lie. If he wants to begin to make amends, he could do a lot worse than to lay some flowers at the memorial plaque to Emi Shakwari, who died at the Israeli embassy in London. It would be a start,